Labour have proposed free breakfast clubs for kids, a policy that is so uncontroversial, surely no one would oppose this. My mistake, there is. Kelvin McKenzie, former editor of The Sun, went on GB News to have a meltdown over feeding kids.
Should you be having kids if you can't afford to feed them breakfast?
Well, actually, the main argument appears to be that if you are skint, what this kind of subsidy will encourage the children to turn up to school, and therefore they then get educated. Actually, breakfast clubs have been around since the 1990s, and all that's happened in that period is that the explosion has been in the number of kids who haven't attended school. Literally, in the last 4 years, has literally doubled, but it's been a rising graph. So there's no correlation to the basic tenet of this argument that, in fact, children do better if they effectively get free food.
Okay.
Actually, not free food subsidized by everybody else in order to make these kids allegedly turn up to school. Surely, I imagine if you're a socialist, you want your child to do well. Why don't you just arrange for that child to go to school without having to be given some granola? But they're not going to bother with breakfast if somebody else will pay for it. That's what it boils down to. So actually, I am not hostile to the idea that if you are completely brassic, right, and that's a difficult area to get into now, but if you're completely broke, then the idea of is a nice thing to do. It's a nice thing to do. What I object to is that all the middle classes and beyond, right, and the wealthy working classes, they're all going to do it. Yeah. Why wouldn't you do it? Well, and I tell you what, there'll be pressure from the children because they want to be with their mates for that 1 hour before they start school at 8:30. Laughing, joking, looking at their phones before their phones are taken off them. I am in favour of helping the absolutely skint. I am not in favour of this general idea of turning our entire nation into subsidy junkies, which effectively comes back to the middle classes, who are the only fools who are currently paying this kind of money.
This is the same Kelvin McKenzie who blamed Hillsborough on the fans. The man who worked for the Murdoch empire, who's paid to have opinions that sucks up to the billionaire class. So am I surprised that he's against feeding children? Of course not. Also, he's full of it when he says he's in favour of helping the absolute skint. Well, where have you been? Your entire journalistic career has been pushing right-wing narratives. When have you backed politicians that have wanted to uplift benefits? Where have you been for calling that? You haven't. Novel. Many people like McKenzie push back on this, saying it's the job of the parent to provide meals for their kids, not to be subsidised by the state. What's your response?
I think it's quite absurd to talk about giving food to poor children as a subsidy. And he goes on in that clip, he calls them subsidy junkies. And this isn't the first time he said that. He said this about 10 months ago on GB News. What's really interesting is he keeps talking about the middle class. The middle class are going to have to fit this bill. They're the ones that are going to have to give food, through taxes to lower class children. But the middle class is rapidly shrinking. People now more than ever are becoming working class, and they are going to need free school meals, because the truth is attendance is at its very lowest because we have a terrible healthcare system. Compared to other countries, other OECD developed nations, we don't have that good childcare. And a lot of places like Sweden or Finland or Estonia have had childcare, especially in schools, because they class free school meals as childcare, since the 1940s. So I think it's quite absurd now to try and look at this as if it's something brand new, and going along, the Sun's narrative of benefits make people lazy, when it's actually worked. And the last thing just right now I want to say on this is it frames poverty as a mischaracterizing action of the parent rather than a deliberate choice that's made by people in parliament. And I think that's the most sinister thing, because regardless of whether those children have to or should be born or not, those children exist. Those children need food to function. They need to be able to go to school and have an equitable place where they can basically work amongst their peers. But instead, what you're actually doing by pushing narratives that the middle class is going to have to fit this bill for working children is you're literally just removing food from a poor child's mouth. And I think it's absolutely disgusting to frame it as a parental choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's no angle where you can argue against this as well. Like, if you look at all the different arguments, let's say it's a subsidy. Okay, then, why does no one talk about corporate subsidies? You're not going to get McKenzie go on there and say, well, we're giving tax breaks to billionaires and corporations because, well, he works for the corporate media. As I said earlier, he works for The Sun, which is owned by the Murdoch empire. They want their taxes to be low. So if we're going to talk about subsidies, let's end subsidies to corporations. I also hate this framing when sometimes we buy into it when we're trying to use it as a linguistic thing when trying to debate people. But I do hate it when we say taxpayers' money, as if the idea that our taxes are going to go up or down depending on what the government spends money on, right? I'm on the lower bracket, 20%. My taxes are going to stay at 20% regardless of what the government spends the money on. So whether it's free school meals or whether it's war, whether it's cutting taxes for billionaires, it's still going to be 20% for me. So my money isn't going, my own personal money isn't going towards it. So I would think, look, as a decent person, I want the state to step in to stop children from going hungry. And this is like the lowest hanging fruit thing as well. And it shows you where the right wing's priorities are, which is that this is a hill they're willing to die on.
Yeah, it's really interesting to also look at the fact that when it comes to free school meals, everything contrary to what McKenzie is saying there is completely false. Because like you said, the main issue for him is to propagate cultural narratives that we've seen for years as editor of The Sun. Of course, he keeps attacking the left, and he has done this throughout his years. Even he had a campaign on Corbyn, calling him a lefty, someone that doesn't believe in the monarchy, things like this. The interesting thing actually is there was a study published in 2023, and it was actually by Sweden. And it took a look at free school meals for children aged from 6 to 16. And what you actually find is a ratio, right? And that ratio says for every 1 part of taxpayer money, 7 parts are put back into the economy. And it makes sense. Because if you think about the economy that we've created, where 2 parents have to work to pay off their mortgage, they don't have enough time in the morning to feed their kids. When you remove that stress in the morning, what you're actually doing is you're allowing more economic activity and a less stressful workforce. And on top of that, when a child is actually fed, nutritionally, they concentrate better in class, they progress way quicker because they're better behaved, and they overall tend to achieve far more because their body is actually functioning. So if you want to talk about taxpayer money, the money gets bought out by economic output. The reality is this isn't about a logistical argument. This is punching down on the poor because it's what he's very good at and it's what he's aligned with for his class.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that when you're saying it's about, coming down on the poor, because you can argue logistically and logically about this policy. You're absolutely right. It's a good multiplier effect. When you take care of your citizens, it's better for society as a whole. If you have children being fed properly, they're better at school, more likely to get a better job, think about tax receipts, all that sorts of thing. But that doesn't matter to people like Kelvin McKenzie. You could even say this actually makes us money. It won't matter because for him, and look, not every right-winger believes this. I think some of them have been fooled by right-wing myths. But someone like Kelvin McKenzie just hates people who are poorer than him. I think that much is clear. So you can come up with the best argument possible and he won't support it. And that just goes across his entire journalistic career. But I do find it funny because the majority of people support something like this. And it just goes to show that the right are very good. They're arguably at their strongest point when it comes to cultural issues. They don't want to talk about economics because when they do that, people are like, wow, you're out of touch. Saying that you don't want free school meals for children is insane. Yet here we are. We have someone on GB News arguing that very point. There's also another point, right? Where they say, well, if you can't afford to feed your children, don't have kids. As if there isn't scenarios out there where when you have kids, you have the money, and then, I don't know, the economy goes really bad and you lose your job and then suddenly you're in a worse financial situation, then what do you do? Are you supposed to predict the future?
Yeah, it falls into sort of like class eugenics almost, and it's really, yeah, it's really ironic because a lot of these people will have children and they will pass down massive amounts of property or massive amount of state, and essentially they will actually give them the handout to make sure that the middle and lower class that he clearly seems to apparently love will not thrive because they won't be able to access those things like property to buy a home, or even your average Tom, Dick, or Harry that wants to set up a business and actually contribute something to the economy. And so I find it very ironic that these are the same people that think and try to tell us that they care about the taxpayer, but they do everything in their power to actually avoid paying taxes in the first place. And that's basically all I have to say on that.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.